Welcome to another quick tutorial. This time we're going to be working with a landscape. First step is going to be to trace the outline of the major shapes. For this, it's important that we're using a good reference image. After we trace the outline, we start blocking in some basic shapes with a mix of oil paint and some solvent, could be turpentine. After this is done, we can start blocking in some basic color arrangements. This is to separate the areas clearly from one another. It is important to start working from general shapes and then focus on the detail. So it's important here we are blocking in part of the mountain, separating it from the foreground and the sky. Now I am adding a bit of texture on the foreground. It is important to create that contrast between the foreground and the background to always use more quantity of paint in the foreground. That is going to give it more depth. I'm going now to the last layer. Let's say if we were working in layers, the sky is always going to be the last layer. So we go from the back to the front. First the sky, then we're going to do the mountains in the back, then the mountain on the right that is a bit closer, and finally we're going to focus on the foreground. Here, when it comes to a mountain that is in the middle ground, let's say, you can see that it is behind the tree. So I'm working that mountain behind the tree, because later when I render the tree, that's going to be some sort of transparency, and we always want to keep those details in the background. Now I'm working on the tree line, which is almost in the foreground. This is going to be really dark, and therefore it's going to create a lot of contrast between the background and the foreground. Finally, some details on the foreground. For this I am using a tiny brush. It's not the tiniest I use, but it is fairly precise, and I'm using the darkest values on the foreground because we want to have that sense of atmospheric perspective. The closer objects are going to be to the spectator, the darker they're going to be. Okay, now I'm using a palette knife to block in a shape of a rock. I wanted to show a different technique with a tool that I'm not using too much. But the palette knife can be really useful, especially for sharp edges and to create a mass of paint that can represent something solid, like in this case the rock. Now I'm defining some really precise details on the left side. I wanted to take a moment in this part to show you how far you can get with a tiny brush and some patience. It is really wonderful what you can do if you're patient enough and you have the right tools. So working small is not an excuse for not using details. Now I'm blocking in with an earth tone the shape of the tree. Usually building a tree is important that we keep the structure. First, I usually imply the general shape of the tree with an earth color. Then I trace the branches, and finally I start working on the leaves from dark to light. So it's important to keep this workflow, because otherwise it's the effect is not as good. So now, as you can see, I'm working on the darker leaves, let's say. Those would be the ones that are far away from the viewer or inside the structure of the tree. And then we apply the brighter leaves, the ones that are exposed to the light, let's say. Those are going to be always either on the warm or on the cold side, depending of where the light source is coming. In this case, the sun is coming from the left. Finally, we continue with some other details. In this case, I'm building a bit of a rustic fence. I'm always using a reference, right, for arranging the details. It's really difficult to make all this out of thin air. So usually get some good reference. In this case, I'm using a picture that I took from a trip to Patagonia, and always keep that in mind. Finally, for the foreground, I'm using a brush horizontally to create some texture on the ground, like if it were rocks or soil. And that's it. I mean, if you keep the structure of the landscape going from the background to the foreground and varying the tones, you should have no problem. Okay, that will be all for this one. Until the next one, take care.